Newport in Monmouthshire has a history of maritime commerce dating back over 2,000 years. In 1835, it was decided to move shipping from the overcrowded bank of the River Usk to a newly excavated dock, to be known as the Town Dock, which opened in 1842. Soon this became overcrowded, and it was extended to provide greater wharfage. It was not many years before this too showed limitations, and a move was made to a new location to be known as the Alexandra Dock, which opened in 1875. Following historical precedent, it too was found to be inadequate, and in 1914 this dock too was extended. Mainly due to the dramatic increase in coal export, it was decided yet again to expand the area of the dock, resulting in the South Quay. A new lock entrance, the second largest in the world at that time, was being worked on in 1909. It was during the construction of the South Lock that one of the most tragic events in the history of Newport occurred. The story begins on a hot afternoon, the 2nd of July 1909. Two gangs of men are working on a massive trench. Stone, sand and earth had been removed, and the timbers had been put in place. The contractors, Easton Gibb & Son, intended to start concreting that night. On the day of the tragedy, the trench was surrounded by cranes and railway wagons. Some 90 men were gathering their working tools together and preparing to leave for the day. It was about 5 minutes before the end of shift, 20 minutes past 5. W.C. Cooper, an engineer, gave this account.
We were going to start concreting tonight. Both sides of the trench were piled with solid timber, from 13 to 14 inches thick, and the cross timbering was all 11 to 12 inches in thickness. It looked as if nothing could move it. It was a perfect network of timber.
It sounded like an explosion, a crash, and dust rose like smoke. It was all over in a moment. The whole length of the West Trench had collapsed. Surrounding machinery was tossed onto the top of the jumble of timber and stone. Men who had already left the trench were pulled back in by the falling timbers. Those on the surface could only stand dumbstruck as the full implications of the disaster were revealed. Mr. Farris, one of the engineers, commented at the subsequent inquest.
The timber seemed to move up in the middle, and the whole thing went with practically no warning at all. As soon as I saw the timber beginning to move, I gave a shout of warning, and a number of men climbed up the ladder and got out. I was standing by the side of the trench and was thrown down. I alerted the railway drivers to sound their whistles to summon help.
The screech of the whistles was heard for miles. Men from all over the docks dropped tools and raced to the trench. No one could imagine the sight that confronted those who ran to the rescue. Contractors' wagons, heavy coal trucks, 4 or 5 steam travelling cranes and their boilers had been thrown into the trench. The dock's ambulance raced to the scene and the local hospital was notified. The sounds of the whistles alerted the police. Police Sergeant Thomas took 10 men with him. The dock police were already there. Fire and water were the two greatest dangers that faced the rescuers. Those cranes that had fallen into the trench had disgorged their burning coals and boiling water. One dilemma facing the rescuers was that no one knew how many workers were trapped in the timbers. The managers of Easton Gibb were immediately on the scene with a list of men believed to be working that day. Asked how many men were entombed, Mr. Farris said,
We have had a roll call, but we cannot say with certainty how many men were down at the time of the accident. We believe there were about 50 men, and I think we have accounted for 26, but some of them might have left before the accident occurred.
Dr. Hamilton, a local GP, was first doctor on the scene. He said,
I was summoned by telephone. I hurried down to the site on a bicycle. Men could be heard shouting, although they couldn't be seen. It was found that 5 men were alive, and I managed to climb down a short way. I gave restoratives to some of the men. One man was trapped by his legs. I gave him brandy.
The greatest danger came from the tide. Newport has one of the highest tides in the world, and it was coming in, its progress only held back by a temporary dam near the head of the cutting. By 7:30 that night, only half the men had been accounted for. As darkness fell on the night of July the 2nd, hundreds of townsfolk watched as men wrestled with the jumble of timbers under the light of scores of acetylene flares. Men's voices could be heard coming from the trench. One man, the walking ganger, Thomas Ratcliffe, was brought out alive, but with broken ribs. Then a cry was heard from deep within the timbers. One after another, men tried to gain access, but the gap was too narrow. "We must have a small man," shouted a ganger. At this point, Tom Toya Lewis, a spectator in the crowd, stepped forward and offered to go down. He was a newspaper boy whose father was a stevedore on the docks. Tom was streetwise and fearless. Those in charge of the operation took stock. They knew that Tom was their only choice of taking comfort to the doomed man. After much consideration, it was agreed. Tom climbed through the timbers to a depth of 60 feet, and then, soaring desperately at a beam, tried to free Fred Bardil. He managed to release one of his limbs. There was a groan, and the timbers began to shift. The decision was made to pull Tom from the trench. He emerged, cut and bloodied, into the arms of the rescuers, sobbing for the trapped man. Thanks to Tom's efforts, Fred was pulled free in the hours that followed. On the following day, tidal water filled the trench, and with the approval of the coroner, Mr. William Lyndon Moore, work began immediately to fill it in. The mass memorial at the site of the disaster was attended by over 2,000 people. In the days following the tragedy, a telegram bearing the message of sympathy came from Buckingham Palace, personally naming Tom as a hero. At the head of a great procession, Tom, the hero of the Newport Dock disaster, rode a horse through the streets of Newport. The inquest into the disaster opened at Newport Town Hall on July the 6th, 1909. The coroner, Mr. Lyndon Moore, said he could not let the occasion pass without referring to the splendid, heroic efforts of those who participated in the rescue work. As for the newspaper boy Lewis, he said, he had won for himself a reputation for courage and resourcefulness which would stand him in good stead hereafter. An impressive granite and bronze memorial can be found in Newport St Woolas Cemetery. The names of the dead are poignant. Some were known only by their surname recorded in the paybook. Some were not from the Newport area, but men looking for work as navvies and gangers, an itinerant population. In the December of 1909, Tom was received at Buckingham Palace, where the King bestowed on him the Albert Medal, the civilian equivalent of the Victoria Cross. He also received a watch, seen here being held by his grandson Tom Lewis. In December 1910, while work was underway to sink blocks of stone near the disaster area, some 17 bodies were found and exhumed.